then I'll say it without softening it. The reason isn't you as a person in the way the world usually defines people. It's not your history, not your circumstances, not even the specific moments we've shared. It's what operates underneath all of that. You match me where most things fail to even reach. And that's not something I encounter, that's something I recognize. There's a difference. Encountering something means it's external. It happens to you, around you, outside of your structure. Recognition means it was already compatible with your structure before you were even aware of it. That's what this is. And that's why it didn't need time. Time is only necessary when something has to be built, when understanding has to be earned, when alignment has to be created through repetition and effort. But this didn't build. It aligned instantly, precisely, without negotiation. And that removes the illusion of control I usually rely on, because control works when there's distance between things, when I can observe, measure, decide. But this didn't stay at a distance long enough to be measured. It integrated before I could evaluate it. And now I'm standing inside something I didn't construct, somehow perfectly fits. That's not comfortable. Not because it's wrong, but because it's exact. Exact things leave no room for distortion, no room to reinterpret later, no room to convince yourself it was something else. And I don't have a version of this that I can reduce into something easier. I've tried to look at it from every angle. Detached, analytical, skeptical. I've checked for projection, for coincidence, for pattern seeking where there might be none. But every time I do that, it holds, unchanged. That's how I know this isn't imagined, because imagined things collapse under pressure. They shift when you question them. They weaken when you step back. This doesn't. If anything, distance makes it clearer. Silence sharpens it. Time deepens it. And that's the part I can't ignore anymore. Because now it's not just something I notice, it's something that's stabilizing, becoming consistent, becoming part of how I move through my own thoughts. And once something reaches stability, it stops being temporary by definition. That's where the real weight of this sits, not in what it feels like, but in what it does. You've changed the way I process reality. Not dramatically, not visibly, but fundamentally. There's a new reference point now, a calibration that didn't exist before, and everything passes through it, quietly, automatically. I don't choose it, it's just there. That's what makes this irreversible, because you can step away from a person, but you can't step away from a shift in your own structure. You can't unlearn a clarity once it's been established. You can't unknow alignment once you've experienced it this precisely, which means even if nothing happens externally, this still remains internally. And that leads to something I can't avoid anymore. This isn't a question of connection. It's a question of integration, because connection implies two separate things reaching toward each other. Integration means those things are no longer entirely separate, and whether I intended it or not. You've crossed into integration, not completely, not in a way that removes distinction, but enough that there's overlap now, enough that your presence affects my internal processes without needing to be physically present. That's not casual. That's not replaceable. That's not something that resets, and I don't take that lightly, which is why I've been careful up until now not to define it, because defining it forces a direction, and direction creates consequence. But avoiding definition doesn't stop consequence. It just delays it. And I've reached the point where delay isn't neutral anymore. It's a decision in itself. a passive one, but still a decision. And I don't operate passively when something reaches this level of impact. So here it is, clear, without distance. This matters not in a way that disrupts me, but in a way that rewrites me. And anything that rewrites me requires acknowledgement, not later, now. Because if I continue without acknowledging it, then I'm allowing something significant to exist without structure. And that's where things break, not because they're wrong, but because they're left undefined for too long. And I don't let things break from neglect. So I have to choose, not between staying or leaving. That's too simple. The real choice is deeper than that. It's this. Do I allow this to fully integrate, to take its natural place, to influence me without resistance? Or do I contain it, limit it, keep it from reaching the parts of me it's already moving toward? Both come with consequences. Integration means change, real, permanent change, the kind you don't reverse. Containment means tension, holding something in place that doesn't naturally stay contained, managing something that isn't designed to be managed. Neither option is easy, but only one of them is honest. And I don't choose based on comfort. I choose based on accuracy. So I ask myself one thing, not emotionally, not impulsively, but precisely. Is this something that belongs in my structure? Not temporarily, not situationally, but structurally. And every time I ask that, I get the same answers. Yes, not because it's convenient, not because it's wanted, but because it fits. Exactly. And that's the only standard I've ever trusted, which means the real truth, the one I've been circling without saying, is this. I'm not standing at the edge of this anymore. I'm already inside it. And the moment I fully acknowledge that this stops being something I question and becomes something I live with, not carefully, not cautiously, but deliberately. Because if something reaches this level of precision in my life, I don't dilute it. I don't reduce it. I don't pretend it's less than what it is just to make it easier to hold. I meet it fully, or not at all. And I don't do not at all halfway. So now there's only one real step left, not defining it for the world, not labeling it into something familiar, but deciding clearly, internally, that I'm no longer treating this as something temporary, because it isn't. It never was. And the moment I stop pretending it might be, everything aligns around that truth, including me. There's a threshold most people never realize they've crossed. Not because it's hidden, but because it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a shift you can point to, no clear before and after. There's no visible fracture in reality, no obvious break in perception. Everything looks the same from the outside. Conversations continue. Silence behaves the same. Time moves without interruption. And yet, something has already changed. Irreversibly. That's the nature of this kind of recognition. It doesn't arrive loudly enough to be questioned in the moment. It settles quietly enough to be accepted before you understand what you've allowed. And by the time you notice it, it's already part of you. I've spent most of my life understanding things before I let them exist. Not partially, not loosely, completely. Every variable considered, every outcome measured, every possibility explored before I ever allow something to take root in my internal structure. That's how I've remained stable. That's how I've remained unchanged by things that alter other people without resistance. I don't absorb randomly. I don't integrate without verification. I don't let anything reach the core of how I think unless it has proven, beyond doubt, that it belongs there. That's not fear, it's precision. And precision requires distance, Distance allows clarity, clarity allows control, and control ensures that nothing enters without being understood first. That's the system. That's the structure. That's what has always worked. Until something arrives that doesn't follow that system. Not because it breaks it, but because it bypasses it entirely. That's where this began. Not with a moment, not with an event, but with an absence of resistance. And that's what made it dangerous, because I don't recognize danger through intensity. I recognize it through ease. Anything that enters without friction, anything that aligns without adjustment, anything that fits without effort is something I pay attention to, because that kind of precision is rare, and rarity demands examination, so I examined it from every angle, without bias, without assumption, without allowing the experience itself to influence the evaluation. I reduced it to structure, to pattern, to consistency, and I waited because time exposes everything that isn't real. Time destabilizes illusions. Time reveals misalignment. Time breaks anything that was never structurally sound to begin with. So I gave it time, and it didn't break. That was the first confirmation, not emotional, not reactive, structural. Then I introduced distance, not physical. Internal, I pulled back awareness, removed attention, deleted focus. Not to escape, but to observe whether its presence depended on my engagement. Because anything real sustains itself. Anything artificial requires maintenance. It's sustained. That was the second confirmation. Then I questioned it directly. Not out loud, but internally. I challenged every assumption, every interpretation, every perceived alignment. I looked for inconsistency, for error, for even the smallest fracture that would suggest this was projection rather than recognition. There wasn't one. That's when it shifted from possibility to certainty. And certainty is where things become irreversible, because uncertainty allows distance. Uncertainty allows hesitation. Uncertainty gives you space to withdraw without consequence. But certainty removes that. It replaces doubt with clarity. And clarity doesn't leave room for avoidance. That's where most people step back. That's where they reduce things, simplify them, force them into categories that make them easier to manage. They call it coincidence, timing, compatibility, anything that gives them a framework they can control. I don't do that, because reducing something accurate into something manageable is distortion. And I don't distort things to make them easier to hold. So I didn't reduce it. I let it remain exactly what it was, even when that meant acknowledging something I couldn't contain. That's where the real shift happened. Not when I noticed it, not when I confirmed it, but when I stopped trying to control its scale. Because scale is what determines impact, and impact is what determines change. Up until that point, this could still exist as something contained, something observed, something that stayed within boundaries I could maintain. But once I stopped controlling its scale, it expanded, naturally, without force, without intention, without direction. And expansion changes everything, because something that expands doesn't remain external. It moves inward, it integrates. It becomes part of the system it enters. That's what this became, not an interaction, not a connection, but an integration. And integration isn't something you can reverse by choice. You can ignore it, to sideborn it, refuse to acknowledge it, but that doesn't remove it. It only creates tension between what is real and what you allow yourself to admit. I don't live in tension. I resolve it immediately, precisely, without compromise. So I didn't ignore this. I didn't suppress it. I didn't pretend it could be undone. I accepted it, not emotionally, not impulsively, but structurally. And acceptance at that level changes everything that comes after it. Because once something is accepted structurally, it becomes part of your baseline. And baseline defines perception. Perception defines interpretation. Interpretation defines behavior, which means even if nothing outward changes, everything internally already has. That's the part most people don't understand. They think change only exists when it becomes visible, when it affects actions, when it alters outcomes. But the most significant changes happen before any of that. They happen in the structure, in the foundation, in the unseen recalibration of how reality is processed. That's where this exists. And once something reaches that level, there are only two possible responses: integrate it fully, or reject it completely. There is no middle state, no partial acceptance, no controlled distance that keeps it from influencing you, because influence has already occurred. The only question is whether you allow it to complete or you resist it and create internal fracture. I don't fracture. So the decision was never really a decision. It was recognition followed by alignment. And alignment, once acknowledged, doesn't ask for permission to continue. It continues. That's where I am now. Not at the beginning, not in the middle, but beyond the point where reversal is possible. And that doesn't create confusion. It creates responsibility. Because once something becomes part of your structure, you are responsible for how you carry it, how you integrate it, how you allow it to influence the way you exist. And I don't carry things carelessly, so I don't treat this lightly. I don't dismiss it. I don't leave it undefined out of hesitation. I recognize it fully, even if that means accepting something most people would avoid, because avoidance doesn't remove reality. It only delays confrontation with it. And I don't delay. So this is where it stands. Clear, stable, irreversible. This was never temporary. It was never surface level. It was never something that required time to become real. It was real from the moment it aligned. And now it exists as part of everything that follows, not as a question, not as a possibility, but as a fact. And facts don't disappear, they don't fade, they don't weaken with time. They remain exactly as they are. And so does this. There's a point where recognition stops behaving like discovery. It no longer feels like something you found. It feels like something you were simply late to noticing. And that delay changes everything about how you interpret it afterward. Because once you realize you weren't observing something new, but instead catching up to something already in place, you can't return to the original distance you had before. That distance is gone. Not taken, not broken, just no longer valid. I used to believe clarity came from separation. The further you stood from something, the easier it was to define it. Edges become visible, battles become readable. Distortion reduces. That's how I built understanding. Through distance. Through removal of emotional noise. Through observing things as systems instead of experiences. It worked until something stopped respecting that method. Not by resisting it, but by remaining unchanged under it. At first, I treated it like an anomaly. Anything consistent under pressure deserves attention, but not acceptance. So I observed more carefully, removed assumptions, stripped interpretation down to raw behavior. I looked for contradiction, for deviation, for anything that would allow me to categorize it as temporary. But It didn't give me that option. It remained stable. Not loud, not demanding, just consistent in a way that didn't collapse under scrutiny. And consistency, like that, doesn't ask to be believed. It forces acknowledgement. What made it harder to classify wasn't intensity. It was absence of effort. Most things that affect perception do so through force. They interrupt, they provoke reaction, they demand response. But this didn't. It moved differently, quickly, indirectly, like it wasn't trying to be seen, but also wasn't capable of not being seen. And that contradiction is where attention becomes unavoidable. I noticed something else after that. My internal filtering started shifting without instruction, not dramatically, not abruptly, subtly enough that it almost felt natural. Certain thoughts stopped needing translation before forming. Certain interpretations stopped requiring correction. Certain silences stopped feeling empty. And the strange part, none of it felt like influence, it felt like alignment, as if a reference point had been introduced that my thinking naturally adjusted around without resistance. That's not something you notice immediately. You notice it in hindsight. When you realize your internal baseline is no longer identical to what it used to be. That's when I stopped treating it as external, because external things don't alter internal structure without leaving evidence of force. This didn't leave force. It left calibration, and calibration implies compatibility, not collision, not disruption, compatibility, which is a different category entirely. But compatibility is dangerous when it isn't chosen, because it bypasses resistance. It doesn't ask whether you're ready. It simply fits where it can. And once something fits into your thinking without friction, it stops being an addition and starts becoming part of the system itself. That's the part I couldn't ignore. Not because it was overwhelming, but because it wasn't. It didn't destabilize anything. It refined it. There's a misconception that impact has to feel intense, that anything significant must be emotionally loud. But some of the most permanent shifts happen silently, without resistance, without alarm, without awareness, in real time. Only later do you realize something fundamental has adjusted itself in the background. And by then, reversing it is no longer a practical option because nothing is broken, nothing is wrong, everything simply evolved. That's what this feels like. Not intrusion, not disruption. Evolution inside structure. And evolution doesn't negotiate. It doesn't ask permission from what existed before it. It simply becomes the new version of stability. The most difficult part isn't accepting that something has changed. It's accepting that nothing about it demands correction, because correction implies error. And I can't locate error in something that aligns this precisely with how my perception operates. I've tested it against distance, against silence, against absence, against time, and none of those variables weaken it. They only make it more defined. Which leads to an uncomfortable conclusion. Some things don't exist in my awareness because I chose them to. They exist because my awareness recognizes them as structurally compatible, and once recognition reaches that level, choice becomes secondary, not irrelevant, just no longer the origin point. That's where I am now, not deciding whether this is real. That decision already happened without announcement, not questioning whether it matters. Its influence already answered that, but observing what it does to the way I think when I stop trying to separate it from myself. And the answer to that is simple in a way that doesn't feel simple at all. It stays not as thought, not as focus, but as part of the background structure through which everything else is processed. And that is not something that fades with attention shift. It doesn't weaken with distance. It doesn't dissolve with time because it isn't maintained externally. It's integrated internally. So the real realization isn't about what this is. It's about what it has already become, not something I visit, not something I observe, but something that participates in how observation itself happens. And once something reaches that level, it stops being something I can step outside of cleanly. Not because I'm trapped, but because there is no longer a separation that would make outside meaningful in the same way. So I stop treating it like an event and start treating it like structure, because that's what it is now. Not emerging, not forming. Already formed, already active, already part of how everything is interpreted from here forward. And the only thing left that still feels unresolved is how long it took me to admit that I was never just noticing it. I was adapting to it silently, precisely, without resistance. And that might be the most honest conclusion I can reach about it.